Pilots and executives from the nation's airlines to Washington. Last night's crash in North Carolina, which killed 17 people, has enhanced the travel anxiety. We begin near Raleigh-Durham with ABC's Linda Patillo.
When American Eagle Flight 3379 went down near Raleigh-Durham last night, it was drizzling and 37 degrees. The National Weather Service had issued a warning for occasional moderate icing between 5,000 and 15,000 feet. A meteorologist who specializes in icing says there were classic icing conditions. There have been 3 other crashes of British-made Jetstreams in the last 4 years under similar circumstances, icy conditions on final approach. Those planes were earlier models of the aircraft which crashed last night, but an aviation safety expert says the differences are minor. An American Eagle Jetstream pilot told ABC News today that pilots had informed the FAA and 2 congressional subcommittees last summer that they had not received training in new emergency procedures for the aircraft and had no special training in wintertime procedures. The pilots warned the FAA that there was going to be a crash. Last night's commuter flight crashed 3.5 miles from the airport runway and broke into 2 large pieces. Rescuers hiked a mile from the road through heavy woods to reach the crash site and search for survivors.
You did what you could to help them, to calm them down, to ease their pain. They were cold, no blankets, no sheets.
Today, NTSB investigators had to wait for bulldozers to carve a road to the crash site before they could begin looking for clues.
We have no idea what may have caused this accident. There were no radio transmissions of trouble last night from the airplane, no indications of any problems from the flight crew.
The flight data and cockpit voice recorders recovered from the crash site last night were sent to Washington, where they will be analyzed. Investigators hope they will hold the answer to what happened to Flight 3379. Linda Patillo, ABC News, Morrisville, North Carolina.
This is Lisa Stark. As the investigation continued, Transportation Secretary Federico Pena ordered the FAA to step up inspections of all air carriers and to speed plans to achieve one level of safety for all aircraft.
Within the next 100 days, we will conclude the current rulemaking process, which is already underway, to elevate commuter airline safety standards to the same level as major carriers.
53 million passengers flew on regional air carriers last year, relying primarily on these planes. The Jetstream is the most widely used. 2 of the planes, the Beech and Fairchild, are manufactured in the United States, the rest outside the country, but all are certified by the FAA.
There isn't an airplane that anyone's operating in the United States that I wouldn't hesitate to tell people to fly on that airplane.
The International Airline Passengers Association looked at fatal regional carrier crashes in the U.S. for the last 15 years. Among the 7 most commonly used planes, some have had deadly crashes and some have not. And the reasons have varied, everything from pilot error to mechanical failure to weather. Around the country, airline passengers are worried.
We're not going to take the small plane from Houston to Beaumont Fort Arthur and want to drive the 98 miles instead.
Well, I'm afraid of flying anyway, so I just thought to myself, I'd rather be alive for the holidays and take the extra 18 hours to get home.
One aviation expert says consumers should put airlines on notice.
Ask a lot of questions and ask pointed questions, and if you don't get good answers, go to another airline.
Johnson says passengers should look at buying an airplane ticket like buying a home or car. Do research about the plane, its owner, and safety history. Lisa Stark, ABC News, Washington.
Well, about this issue of airline safety and public anxiety with John Nance. He's both an airline analyst and a commercial airline pilot. Are we having more crashes than, say, the industry might expect?
Well, I think we are. We had a period of almost 2 years in which almost nothing bad happened. It was a very quiet period, and coming out of that is a bit of a shock. As the amount of air traffic increases, eventually we're going to end up putting one on the ground about every couple of weeks just because of the expansion in travel if we don't reduce the margins.
One on the ground every couple of weeks?
Projecting forward in the next 20 years, if we don't get the safety margins much better, if we don't reduce the number of accidents in terms of percentage, we are going to end up with the same safety level, giving us a lot more accidents. And we've got to make sure that doesn't happen.
I'm sure you'd agree there is a feeling out there among some members of the public that the commuter industry is really troubled.
Well, in many respects, it has been troubled all along, from the very day that we tried to bring it into the mainstream of airline operations. I mean, deregulation has done this. The major airlines have got to take full responsibility for their carriers if they put their logo on the side. So I'm talking about making sure that when logos are shared, and you have people getting on these little airplanes, seeing the logo of United or American or Delta, that they can be assured that that big airline is taking care of every aspect of safety for that small airplane.
John Nance, thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter.
5379, en route from Greensboro, North Carolina, crashed last night about 7 p.m. as it approached Raleigh-Durham International Airport. At the time, the temperature was 37 degrees with rain and fog. The plane, like the one pictured here, was a Jetstream Super 31 manufactured by British Aerospace. In October, another American Eagle flight, that one a French-Italian ATR-72 turboprop similar to this smaller model, crashed in Indiana, killing all 68 aboard. Ice on the wings is the suspected cause. Just last week, the federal government banned the use of those turboprop airplanes in icy weather. The two American Eagle crashes coming just 6 weeks apart again heightened concern about regional airlines. Some are owned by the major airlines, as is American Eagle. Others are a patchwork system of independent operations in partnership deals with the big carriers, sharing paint colors, but sometimes not the same safety standards. Most of the planes flown by regional carriers are defined as commuter aircraft, small turboprop or piston engine propeller planes with 30 or fewer seats. FAA regulations have been less stringent for those small planes, and critics say crash records indicate they are indeed more dangerous. In the past 5 years, the big carriers, which fly mostly jets, have averaged 2.9 accidents per million departures, but commuter carriers have averaged 6.6 accidents. Some crashes can be attributed to lower standards for safety devices, like the one last December in Hibbing, Minnesota, that killed 18 people. The 19-passenger turboprop, also a Jetstream 31, hit some trees and then a hill after the flight crew lost track of altitude. Unlike larger planes, the commuter plane had no ground proximity warning system which would have alerted the crew to pull up. After that crash, the FAA required proximity alarms in all turboprops with 10 or more seats, but not in those with fewer than 10 seats. And they account for a quarter of all planes used by regional airlines. Pilots of small planes may also have lower training requirements. FAA rules specify minimum training hours for big plane pilots, but regional airlines can have varying requirements. In November, the International Airline Passengers Association said small commuter planes should be avoided for safety reasons. But increasingly, passengers have little or no choice on whether to fly small planes. Since industry deregulation in 1978, about 250 U.S. cities once served by big carriers now only have regional service, and most of that on small prop planes. In North Carolina earlier today, Transportation Secretary Federico Pena announced the government would be taking additional steps to address commuter airline safety.
Within the next 100 days, we will conclude the current rulemaking process, which is already underway, to elevate commuter airline safety standards to the same level as major carriers. This will include the following areas: pilot training and certification, flight and duty time, and flight dispatching. I want to emphasize that aviation is a shared responsibility between the federal government and the airline industry. The industry has its job and responsibility, as do we. When necessary, we will not hesitate to take whatever action is necessary to see that our safety rules are fully met.
Now, some analysis from two safety experts. Jim Burnett is the former chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board. He's now a transportation consultant in Arkansas and joins us from Conway, Arkansas. Geraldine Frankowski is director of the Aviation Consumer Action Project in Washington. Mr. Burnett, last month the NTSB called for tougher safety regulations for commuter airlines. Has Secretary Pena adequately answered that call?
Well, of course, no regulations have been implemented yet. It seems that Secretary Pena is being responsive to those recommendations, and I would emphasize that the NTSB recommendations would not remove all distinctions between large aircraft and smaller aircraft, but would attempt to close those distinctions, at least for aircraft carrying 20 or more passengers, and to somewhat close them to the extent practical for aircraft down to the 10-passenger size.
Yeah. Does the move today, announced today, satisfy you, Ms. Frankowski?
There are, the question that came up is what this really means to passengers. There has been a perception among passengers that travel on smaller planes is less safe, not necessarily unsafe, but certainly less safe, and you've quoted some statistics which give some credence to that argument. What we'd like to see the Department of Transportation do now, though, is print an assessment for passengers to make decisions when they fly. An assessment of the commuter air carriers, which rules they're following and to which extent. One example you mentioned earlier is that the ground proximity warning system required on all commuter craft was not present on this aircraft. That's information that can help passengers make decisions about air travel.
Mr. Burnett, American Eagle, which is the case in point with the two recent crashes, says it has always operated to the higher standard in its commuter airline, the higher standard of the bigger planes in the main carrier. If so, how could different standards be implicated in a crash like this one, if they are?
Well, we know, of course, that the larger aircraft have always had ground proximity warning systems. This one didn't. It falls within an exception to the regulation because it had an alternate system, but that exception only lasts for a couple of years, so eventually that aircraft would have had to be re-equipped. So that's an example of how the aircraft they're operating are not identical in the terms of the required equipment as to the larger aircraft. As to the operating practices, which is really governed by Part 135, they may be in complete conformance, although some of the media statements that have been made by American Airlines as of last night led me to suspect that they may not be in complete conformance as far as the duty time and the rest time for their flight crew. So I would like to ask them some more questions about that, but I don't have the opportunity anymore to do that.
Ms. Frankowski, I come back to the question of safety on smaller or bigger planes. I'm sure, like me, a lot of the public is confused about this. Are these smaller planes less safe in themselves, or is it all in the training, scheduling, equipment, and so on the way they're flown? Is it in the planes themselves or the way they're flown?
It's a hard question to answer, and it may well be a combination of both. But we know that the performance of these aircraft can be improved by operating them to a higher standard, improving the training, giving them flight dispatch service.
What is that, flight dispatch service?
Flight dispatch service is having a licensed professional to handle the duties of checking the fuel, checking the weight and balance of the aircraft, and most importantly, checking the critical surfaces of the aircraft prior to takeoff to check for contamination such as ice.
Are those not checked now?
The responsibilities in commuter aircraft nearly all fall to the pilot in command, and the most recent regulations put out by the FAA this January for commuter aircraft virtually allow the pilot to check for contamination, for ice contamination on the wings by looking from the cockpit. To take a recent example, in 1992, there was a crash caused by ice, the NTSB found at LaGuardia Airport, attributed to ice, but the pilot said they didn't see any ice on the wings. So
well, excuse me for interrupting you, but just on that point, who would check that in a big airline operating under the more stringent regulations?
The flight dispatcher and other staff around the air, all of the pre-flight preparations.
Mr. Burnett, how do you answer that question? Are smaller planes inherently less safe in themselves, or is it these other factors, the equipment they have, the way they're flown, the training, and so on?
Well, they are inherently less safe.
Why are they inherently less safe?
Is one example. With large aircraft, you have a heated wing. With the turboprop aircraft, generally you have a de-icing boot, and the use of that boot has to be managed correctly by the flight crew.
What is a de-icing boot?
Well, it breaks the ice off the leading edge of the wing. So you really have a more of a challenge flying in de-icing conditions with turboprop aircraft. There are also problems with tail icing that you don't have generally with the jet aircraft. And this is a bigger challenge for the flight crews. And generally, the flight crews on the commuter airlines are not as extensively trained, not to say that they're not very professional, but they're not as extensively trained, and they're not as seasoned because the career path is to move up from the...
Another plane crash yesterday, and once again, it was a deadly scene. Joel Loy is in North Carolina with our report.
Witnesses who rushed to the scene said they heard the cries of the survivors as the plane's cockpit burned. One of the passengers was walking around in shock, looking for his wife. Nearby resident David Stanley was one of the first on the scene. He told his story by telephone.
After I called 911, I looked out the window and I saw the fire in the background, and I got my neighbor and he and I headed over to the crash site. There was one person walking around. Believe it or not, he was walking around. And he was in shock, and I said, "Sir, are you all right?" He says, "I'm looking for my wife."
With the plane's fuselage broken in two, the wreckage was scattered over 500 yards, just 3 miles from the Raleigh-Durham airport.
A lot of debris. It's just a bad scene.
15 people died, and the 5 survivors were taken to area hospitals. One of them was 60-year-old Don Merkel of Illinois. He suffered broken ribs and a bruised lung. He is listed in serious but stable condition. While his family closely watched for updates on the crash, his wife Lois says waiting to hear about her husband was unbearable.
Well, I thank God that my prayers were answered, because until I heard the news, I was praying.
A spokesperson for the FAA says there was no indication of trouble in the minutes before the crash. American Eagle also wants to get to the bottom of this.
We will investigate this accident aggressively on our own and will, of course, cooperate fully with officials of the National Transportation Safety Board and other investigative agencies.
Transportation Secretary Federico Pena has now announced emergency measures using the help of 300 new inspectors to safety audit every airline in the country.
And Joel Lloyd joins us now from the Raleigh-Durham International Airport near the site of last night's crash. Joel, have the bodies of the victims been recovered yet?
No, not entirely, Bill. Last night, they removed 7 people from there. 2 of them died. 5 survived, as you probably know by now. So today's efforts are directed at finding and removing the 13 remaining bodies.
What news do we have of the survivors?
The survivors were all in critical condition last evening. Now, some of them have been upgraded to serious condition, and as is so important, families are very important in situations like this. American Eagle is flying in some of the families of the survivors so they can be with their loved ones.
Behind you, it looks very foggy. What's going on at the crash site right now?
Well, the crash site, as you can see, the weather here is very foggy. I'm standing by the runways where that plane was supposed to land last night, and as you can see, you can hardly see anything. The crash site is 3 to 4 miles from here. It's in a densely wooded area, so they're using bulldozers to make a road to get equipment in there to help straighten out the situation there.
There's been a lot of controversy about these little commuter planes not having ground proximity warning systems. Did this plane have such a system?
Well, the answer is yes and no to that, Bill. In April of '94, this year, all aircraft were supposed to have systems that actually gave you an audible warning when the plane was too close to the ground. American Eagle, as I understand, got an exemption for that because they have another system that tells you how close you are to the ground but does not give you an actual warning. So no, they did not have this new system in place.
Joel Lloyd in North Carolina, thanks very much for that report. You are watching 29.